Hi everyone, it's James here. How are you all doing? Welcome to another video. So yes, I'm here with Rosie here today, and she's enjoying her day, as am I. Got a day off, so I thought I'd do a quick video looking at a theme which I've never seen done before. And the idea of it came to me just the other day. I was at work and a work colleague of mine presented me completely out of the blue with a copy of this record, Bat Out of Hell. I tell a lie, it wasn't completely out of the blue. He did warn me that it might be coming. This guy, he's a bit of an old punk and he still buys second-hand records. I think he picked this one up from a charity shop for next to nothing. Played it a couple of times, but not really his thing, you know, so he passed it on to me. I've never actually owned this record before either, and I've not spun it yet. I've got memories of it from back in the day, you know, but I've never been into Meatloaf or anything. But I was reminded, looking at the back, that it was produced, this album was produced, engineered and mixed by the great Todd Rundgren. And a while ago, not so long ago, I was also listening to this record, which is a recent pickup. This is Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt. Now, what is the link between Bat Out of Hell and Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt? Well, the link that came to me is records that were produced by musicians who themselves were formerly in bands. So that got me thinking of a video where we looked at musicians who turned into producers. Now clearly, you know, most record producers were probably musicians. You know, take anybody, Phil Spector, George Martin, whatever, they all started out as musicians pretty much and became producers. But what I'm looking at here is musicians who made their name as musicians in bands. Or as a solo artist, and then later went on to become a producer, either a career producer or maybe just a one-off producer. But what links them all is that they started out in bands, they first got a name for themselves just as musicians and then became producers afterwards. So clearly Todd Rundgren had been in the Nas, who were an American kind of psych rock band. Now I don't know whether he produced the Nas records or not. I suspect he didn't, but I could be wrong. But anyway, he went on obviously to a very long and prestigious career as a record producer, producing himself and producing lots of other artists as well, and we'll look at that in a different video. And this album, Rock Bottom, pop freaks and trivia heads will know, was produced by Nick Mason out of Pink Floyd, and they'd been friends from the 60s. They were both on the underground scene when Robert Wyatt was in the Soft Machine, and obviously Nick Mason was in Pink Floyd, and they used to share bills a lot together, I think. They used to play at the UFO Club together and various other kind of hip, swinging 60s venues. When Robert Wyatt had his accident and plunged out of an upstairs window and damaged his back and ended up in a wheelchair, he wanted to make a solo album and he chose Nick Mason to produce it. Interesting choice, because Nick was a drummer. Nick never really did any production in Pink Floyd, so that was quite an interesting choice. And I think Robert Wyatt in later years said that Nick Mason, he didn't come into it as a musical producer. He said you couldn't really talk arrangements with Nick. It was probably the engineer who did most of the miking up and the clever stuff. I think Nick was mainly there as a kind of motivator and as a kind of soundboard for Robert, and you know, somebody to encourage him and to nurture him. Nick Mason is a very genial chap, really, I think, and he did do a couple of productions in later years. Famously, he produced one of the albums by The Damned. I'm not sure which one it was, but The Damned, when The Damned first broke on the scene, they were big fans of early Pink Floyd, and they wanted Syd Barrett to produce their album. But obviously, you know, Syd Barrett was an acid casualty by this point, so they got Nick Mason instead. And Nick Mason always said it was a complete culture shock to him. You know, he came in off the golf course kind of thing, you know, and the Damned were fighting in the studio and drinking and taking drugs or whatever. And he said it was like it was like being a primary school teacher, you know, in a playground situation. I don't think the Damned were particularly impressed by Nick Mason, really, but anyway, it was quite a funny story. Then this one sprung to mind. This is AC/DC, whose first few albums were produced by Vanda and Young. So that was Harry Vanda and George Young. Of course, George Young was the elder brother of Angus and Malcolm Young, and he'd started his career in the great Australian garage rock band, the Easy Beats, famous for having done Friday on My Mind. So there's an example. George Young, he was just a guy in a band, later on became part of an extremely successful and prestigious and brilliant record production team. This next one, we've got the great West Midlands band Slade, whose records were produced by Chas Chandler, who obviously had, well, he was in the Animals originally, so that's where he made a name for himself. Later on became famous for all sorts of things. You know, he was chiefly famous, I guess, for having brought Jimi Hendrix over to the UK, and you know, he worked with a lot of cool people, but not quite sure how Chas Chandler discovered Slade or what the link was there, but he was certainly their Svengali for a number of years and produced many of their records. So there we go, Slade, Chas Chandler. Okay, I'm cutting the next one in, so if the dog has disappeared, don't be disconcerted. I wanted to show this one because this is a record that I have revisited recently. This is Children by The Mission, and this came out in 1988 and was produced by John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. And I don't know whether John Paul Jones has done a lot of production work for other bands and artists over the years. He probably has. It's interesting because John Paul Jones was not really the producer of Led Zeppelin. That was always Jimmy Page. I think Jimmy Page always knew how Led Zeppelin should sound, and he crafted their sound in the studio. But what's interesting about this record by The Mission is that it really does have a Led Zeppelin vibe to it. John Paul Jones had clearly been watching Jimmy in the studio and had, you know, learned a few tricks, shall we say. The Mission, I think they were from Leeds back in the 80s. They were a kind of offshoot of the band The Sisters of Mercy, and that was a whole kind of strand of alternative, vaguely gothic English rock music, which kind of passed me by at the time. I'm starting to discover it more now, really. This is the only album by The Mission I've ever heard, and I do like it, but the main reason I like it actually is the production. It's got an unmistakable Led Zeppelin vibe to it. It's not Led Zeppelin copying or anything, it's just there's something about it, just the textures, the sound on the guitars and the drums. It's got a kind of dark, epic vibe to it. Really good, great record. This next one, I guess, is the most obvious one. You know, there are some people who start out in bands and then their production career just totally eclipses anything that they did on their own, and this is a classic example, I guess. This is the Talking Heads and their albums, More Songs About Buildings and Food, and this was produced by Brian Eno from Roxy Music, and yeah, he doesn't need much introduction. You know, he did all sorts. He did U2, he did, I mean, who didn't Brian Eno do? He just had the most incredible production CV. But yeah, he started out as the untrained keyboard player, shall we say, in Roxy Music. Right, this is an interesting one. This is Split Enz and their album Mental Notes, which I think was their first album, and this was produced by somebody who had been in the same band as Brian Eno. It was produced by Phil Manzanera, and very, very strange album. I've talked about this album before. It's kind of really weird, kind of art rock, very quirky, very unusual. I think Rob Walker once described it as terrible. I quite like it. It's kind of quirky and different, shall we say. But yeah, produced by Phil Manzanera from Roxy Music. This next one, there's quite a good story attached to this. This is the Gun Club and their album Miami. So the Gun Club, and I think they were from LA, weren't they? And the main guy in the band was called Jeffrey Lee Pierce. So the Gun Club were a sort of psychobilly band. They were really kind of, I don't know, they had a kind of post-punk feel to them, all sort of stirred in with Americana, really, a bit of kind of, you know, early rock and roll stuff. Really interesting band, actually. But Jeffrey Lee Pierce, he was the president of the Blondie fan club, and because of having that position, he got to know the band a little bit, and he became friends with Chris Stein from Blondie, and Chris went on to produce this record. So there we go. The first album, which I think is called, I think it's The Fire of Love. I'm not sure if Chris produced that one as well. I don't think he did, but I could be wrong. But Chris Stein from Blondie certainly produced this one, Miami, by the Gun Club. And this next story is fairly similar, I guess. This is Altered Images and their album Happy Birthday. Altered Images, obviously they were a kind of new pop band from the early 80s, and I think what happened with this lot, they went on tour with Susie and the Banshees, and they were big fans of Susie and the band in general, and I think they passed a demo tape to them. That's how they got the support slot with Susie and the Banshees. And then the bass player from Susie and the Banshees, who was Steve Severin, then went on to produce the debut album by Altered Images. And this record, it's quite surprising when you hear it. If you think of Altered Images as just being, you know, happy birthday, kind of fluffy early 80s pop music, this record actually, it's much more left field. It sounds more like a post-punk kind of album. It's got a touch of the Banshees to it, really. It's got a kind of slightly cold, disconcerting feel to some of the tracks. You can definitely detect the influence of Steve Severin. Their later records were not produced by him, I don't think, and they became more of a fluffy kind of pop group, you know. Okay, so we've got two more, and these two I guess are connected. We've got East Side Story by Squeeze, their fourth album from 1981. This has actually got two producers, both of which were in bands. The first track, In Quintessence, is produced by Dave Edmunds, who'd been in Rock Pile, obviously. The rest of the album was co-produced by Roger Bikiran, who'd done a lot of new wave productions, but more famously Elvis Costello was brought on board to produce Squeeze. He'd become friends of theirs by this point. They toured together in 1981. They did a huge tour of America together, which has become quite a legendary tour. And Costello and the Attractions were big fans of Squeeze. They'd played the Argy Bargy album on their tour bus apparently non-stop. Elvis came in. At the time, Elvis was in a bit of a state. I think he was just off the back of making the album Trust, and the Attractions had gone into that project. They were all drinking too much and taking drugs and arguing with each other and fighting. So when Costello came on board to do East Side Story, he kind of laid down the rules when he first came in. He said, you know, no drinking, no boozing, no taking drugs, and we're going to start at 10 in the morning and go through to 6 in the evening, and we're going to eat salads. And Chris Difford always said that he kind of responded to that by agreeing to stop drinking lager and to move on to the cider. So that's what happened with that one. And Elvis was absolutely pivotal in the song Labelled With Love, which would never have been recorded had it not been for him. He heard it on a tape that Glenn Tilbrook was playing him. Glenn had not even thought of it as a song for the album. It was a sort of country and western song, but of course Elvis was a big fan of country music, so he made Glenn play the tape back, and then he got them to record it, and it became one of their biggest hits. Elvis was also responsible for getting Paul Carrack to sing Tempted, and that was a great vocal performance by him as well. So that was an interesting one. And finally, we'll stick with Costello, and of course his great run of albums that he did at the start of his career. Maybe the first, I don't know, the first 5 or 6 albums, something like that, were produced by the great Nick Lowe. And he'd started his career in the band Brunsley Schwartz. I think, was he the bass player or the guitar player? Richard McCook will know that one. And I checked, and Brunsley Schwartz were not produced by Nick Lowe, so he started out in that band just as a band member, and then somehow, I don't know quite what happened, he became involved with Stiff Records and Elvis's manager Jake Riviera, and just ended up being this great kind of new wave producer. So he produced all those great early albums, you know, Armed Forces and Trust and all those. And also Nick Lowe, I think he produced New Rose by The Damned as well. So he was a kind of pub rocker, but he was really on the scene during that early punk, new wave kind of era, and he just did so many great records. And then of course later on he went on to produce himself as well. So that's it, that's my selection. There were loads more, but those are my 10. My mind is already working overtime on this one, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. So hope you enjoyed the video, take care, see you soon, bye.